Well, friends, up till now, we discussed the relationship between history and different disciplines, how history has been enriching in its stride towards better understanding of history with the help of auxiliary sciences, belonging to science proper, and then social sciences and humanities. So, in other words, history has really evolved as an interdisciplinary subject. Now, from today onwards, we will be going towards tracing the history of history, because up till now we were looking at the building blocks of history and what are the methods for collecting those building blocks and arranging them in a in a shape in which they should not fall from the seams. They should go for making a structure in a very streamlined manner. Therefore, when now we will be tracing since when this consciousness about history emerged, why they started thinking of understanding history, knowing history. What did they mean by that? So it has a very long history behind it. Therefore, we will go into the question of origins of historical narrative. The science of history come down to us in basically in two streams, broadly speaking. Eastern Mediterranean route, whose influence spread from Greece and Rome to the Western Asia and Iraq, and Chinese historiography, and uh, in Chinese historiography. Then the immediate question which will come to us is, what about our India and Iran? What was the position there? You said two streams. You are considering Mediterranean and Chinese historiography. What about the areas in between the two? So in India, despite Kalhan's exceptional work, and in Persia, though some elements of history are there to be found in Firdausi's Shahnama, despite his basically fictional character, historical traditions remained very weak in these areas. Unlike their counterparts in Mediterranean, Greece, and in the neighborhood China. So it is in Greece that the basic historical tradition that has guided all subsequent histories, with the exception of China, because China had an independent autonomous origin, where an independent historical tradition developed, originated in the 5th century BC under the notable efforts, among others, of Herodotus and Thucydides. This is, however, not to say that element of history were not present earlier or in other civilizations, other countries. Before 5000 BC, the rulers of Egypt, for example, and Iraq, they developed a tradition of proclaiming their achievements. Most often, these were narrations of military successes given to much exaggeration on the inscriptions of those rulers. This was the first and obviously very rudimentary beginning of political history. Gradually, in about 1000 BC, the rulers, most significantly of Iraq and to some extent of Egypt, not only recorded their achievements but also those of their predecessors, their fathers and others. Hence, we notice that in these annals, the first elements of dynastic history could be traced. Despite their obvious exaggeration, because they are writing about their achievements, so they will go on claiming the sky. So these documents are important. Despite this lacuna, they are important in that they suggest the existence of an audience interest in knowing about the events of the past. When I am saying this, I am conscious of modern historians' predilections also. When we write history, we also have, when we write articles or the books, we also have an idea of a prefigured audience. We know that if I write on this subject, there it will find so many readers. So this also they had, that there was some audience available and they were looking forward to read those inscriptions in which they were claiming their achievements. So from 9th century BC onwards, when the Assyrians began to build an empire, chronicles began to be written. Since then, we can trace the history of, history of history. You see, I have these. This is a very specialized kind of writing, chronicles. They began to be written. These have, however, not survived. That creates another problem. I will discuss that. But the question arises, if they have not survived, then how can we know about them? We can know about their existence, we can assume that from their references in some of the succeeding inscriptions. They refer to the earlier inscriptions. After Assyrians, it seems the Phoenicians residing in Palestine followed the suit. Their chronicles have again been destroyed. A result of this semi historical tradition, much mixed with fables and myths, which survives in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. In this sense, it is important to note that even where fables and myths are narrated, these are so narrated as to appear historical, suggesting that thereby that the people to which Bible was addressing, they had become historical or at least had a sense of history, because they are listening to something which had happened much earlier. So the Assyrian influence can be seen not just in certain descriptions, as for instance in the descriptions of Noah's flood, and this Noah's flood is a very important theme in many of our Indian literature also. So, but even more significantly in its allusions to chronology, the pattern of the narration of succession of prophets, that tends to imitate the pattern of the succession of rulers. Besides, some parts of the Bible are undoubtedly historical. Breste has relied on Bible to confirm the presence of Jews in Egypt. There is thus already an emerging historical tradition existing when Greek historiography, in a major leap forward, began to take shape. This historiography, notably under Herodotus and Thucydides, these two personalities are very, very outstanding. So this will occupy our space also in discussing these two personalities and their contributions to historiography. So these two personalities indeed belittle the contribution of all previous historical traditions. Now let us trace the Greek historiography, rise of Greek historiography. I have given you the preliminary background of it. Greek historiography originated in the activities of a group of writers whom the Greeks called logographoi, which means logographers. They would narrate the events. Logography was the prose collection or compilation of oral traditions relating to the origins of towns, peoples, and places, etc. It combined geographical with cultural information and might be seen as an early form of cultural anthropology. Hecataeus of Miletus, the best known of the logographers, defines his task in his classic Genealogia, which was composed around 490 BC, as follows. He is saying that I write what I consider the truth. I write what I consider the truth, for the things the Greeks tell us are, in my opinion, full of contradictions and worthy to be laughed out of court. This is what his observations are. So the logographers also served as advocates and speech writers in the courts of rulers, and the need to ascertain facts and make arguments clearly influenced their writings. The past figures, prominently in many genres of archaic Greek poetry, but it was not until the second half of the 5th century BC that the genre of historiography emerged. Unfortunately, most of the first historiographic works have been lost in transmission process, and often it is even difficult for, if not outright impossible, to find reliable dates for the authors and their works. However, two works from the second half of the 5th century BC have been fully preserved. They have come down to us intact. I mean the Herodotus' narrative of encounters between East and West, which culminated in the Persian Wars. He is actually writing about Persian Wars, and Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian Wars. Both were successful, at least, in establishing the new genre, that this is a new chapter of historiography, and proved so influential in its further development that it has become natural to view their works within the frame of historiography of modern times. It is equally important to contextualize the rise of Greek historiography in the contemporary intellectual environment of that time. One of the most striking cultural developments in 5th century BC is the Greece was the invention of prose. This was the most important discovery or most important addition that they invented invention of prose. Up till now, everything was in the poetic form. So, in a way, we can also say that poetics forms the basics of historiography of Greece. Of course, there was prose before, but the maîtres de vérité, that is, in control of truth, in archaic Greece, used poetry to present their insights. The problem with poetry is that poets have a tendency to exaggerate something. They will go on using hyperbolics and other things. But the historian, when he is writing in prose, this kind of thing will be limited. With the exception of laws, authoritative expressions were made in the verses until 5th, 4th century BC, when together with a strengthening of a literacy in a still predominantly oral society, prose genres emerged that presented new views of the world. These texts were given labels such as science, oratory, historiography, and philosophy, but ought not to be forgotten that Hippocrates, Gorgias, Herodotus, and Plato could not rely on these fixed kind of genres. While the boundaries of genres were still fluent, they were emerging, so they were fluent. And while there are many similarities between texts that, for our understanding belong to a very different genre or genres, authors took pains to define their own approach to or by delimiting them from others. The fluidity, the openness, and competitiveness within emerging field of prose, genres make it particularly important to view the rise of Greek historiography against the backdrop of contemporary intellectual developments, and to trace back the manifold interactions between the works of Herodotus and Thucydides on the one hand and the boom of rhetoric and science on the other. In many regards, the first Greek historians were heavily indebted to the Homeric epics. So, in many regards, the first Greek historians were heavily indebted to the Homeric epics. Obviously, I'm talking about Odyssey and Iliad. So, the focus on a great war for Herodotus, he is writing histories, and Thucydides, history of the Peloponnesian War. Both are dealing with war. So, war is at the center of the narration. Now, one thing here I would also like to point out is look at the, Herodotus is considered to be the father of history. So, look at the title of his, book. He is not saying history of Greece. He is not saying history of, Greco-Roman Empire or something like that. He is not saying history of Thrace or history of, Crete. Uh, what he is saying is giving us a very generic, title, histories. Means he is dealing with many histories. So this title itself is very remarkable. But he is dealing with the war between Greece and Persia. Possibly, we can't be very sure in history like this. Possibly, Iliad and other poetic compositions, they might have influenced them in some way. The historian's artful presentation of the past, including anachronisms or different levels of focalization, this is successfully applies narrative devices familiar from the epics to more recent events of historical times. One of the most striking differences, however, from the epics was which aligns historiography with contemporaneous prose genres is the establishment of narrational authority. Narrational authority. So the muses who serve the epic narrator and many other poets so well are not invoked by the historians, who instead have to create credibility by proof. Now these two words are very important: proof and plausible narration. Not only proof is important, the narration should be plausible, convincing. So, as a specific strategy was made for making one's account credible, the use was made of a term called tekmeria. This is a very important word, terminology in Greek, understanding Greek historiography. The term derives from the verb tekmerestai, which means assign, ordain, and is related to Homeric noun tekmar, which means fixed mark, boundary, etc., also sure sign or token. This is also the basic meaning of Tecmerian, used in classical literature as Terrius technicus for proof. Scientists as well as orators, especially in court speeches, adduce Tecmeria to buttress their arguments. Herodotus and Thucydides made use of Tecmeria to illustrate their intellectual background. For example, let us consider Herodotus' engagement to sophists. Sophists were a class of people at that time. They used to wander from place to place looking for, you know, uh, their survival. So they were actually teachers. Some people suggest that the term Sufi in Persian, Persian literature traces its origin in the sophists of Greek literature. So, sophists, they were teachers who went from polis to polis, that is, city states to city states, and made their living by instructing Juvenes Dori in all kinds of arts, particularly in rhetoric. Sophists at those times advocated the relativity of norms and values. How the mankind is, or his behavior is related to these two primary concepts, norms and values. When Herodotus reports, I'm giving you one example from his book, Histories, when he reports Cambyses' transgressions, for example, the burning of the statues of gods by the victorious people, he concludes that Cambyses had committed those crimes out of madness. Since each people regard their custom as the best, it must be a madman who would violate such basic rules of his own culture. There is plenty of other evidence to support this idea that this opinion of one's own customs is universal, but there is one instance. During Darius's reign, he invited some Greeks who were present to a conference and asked how much money it would take for them to be prepared to eat the corpses of their fathers. They replied that they would not do for that for any amount of money. Any amount of money. Next, Darius summoned some members of an Indian tribe known as Kalatiye. We'll have to look which tribe he is referring to, but at the moment this is sufficient because he himself is writing that this is an Indian tribe. Kaliyate, who eat their parents, they say, who eat their parents and ask them in the presence of Greeks with an interpreter present so that they could understand what was being said and how much money it would take for them to be willing to, you know, willing to cremate their father's corpses. They cried out in horror and told him not to say such appalling things. This is, this example I give from Herodotus. Herodotus closes his argument with a reference to Pindar's, custom is king of all. The notion that validity of nomoi differs from culture to culture is characteristic of the general relativism generally associated with sophistic milieu. So, Mori, specifically Herodotus' reflection is um, the reminiscent of a passage in Desoi Logoi, a sophisticated treatise in which the author suggests that if all men brought together what they would deem to be shameful and then took for the form this leap took from this leap what they considered to be noble, nothing would be left. Herodotus shares this with this fragment the insight into the relativity of value. However, this leads to a rather different conclusions. The argument that he must be made who violates the basic laws of his own culture implies that the variety of laws across cultures does not challenge their validity within their respective cultural zone. On the contrary, the adherence of the people to various laws forms itself something like a master law. So, in having a Persian or Greek voice, the general rule of law was that Darius, through his investigation, and Pindar, through his nome, Herodotus both considers and overcomes the cultural relativism which is there. So instead of challenging the traditional values, the insight into the relativity of norms is used to underscore their authority within their own culture. Besides the content, the form of argument, the use of techmarion testifies to the intellectual world in which Herodotus was embedded, because they would reflect that kind of thing. Not only does the elaborate presentation of proof, that is techmeria, illustrates the increasing influence of rhetoric in 5th century BC, but ethnic or ethnographical context of this techmarion and the scientific context of others, as for the example in geological discussions of Egypt. This you can find in book number 2, para number 13, 1. The whole, story is given there. I have, taken from there. This suggests a more specific parallel to the contemporary medical and scientific writers in whose work techmedia were abounded, that abounds. Because their discipline cannot move without the assistance of proofs. So when, for example, the author of On the Nature of Man, that is end of 5th century BC it was written, he writes that polemicizes against other writers, he complains that each adds to his account pieces of evidence and proofs which mean nothing, again from the same chapter, only to announce regarding himself not much later. I will give proofs, Herodotus says, I will give proofs and point out necessary causes why everything grows and so decreases the body. Therefore, the use and prominence of techmaria indicates the significance and centrality of proof in Greek, historical narrative. So, to conclude, I would say that look here, there is a realization among these early historians that proof should be the most important, you know, litmus test on the basis of which one should try to write history. If you remember my first lecture, I told you that facts are only those facts or historical facts which are verifiable, which are available to others also. They can read it afresh and they can form their own opinion. So it will depend on the statistics of how many are in favor of that and how many are critical. We can decide what kind of history is to be gained. So, with this, I conclude today's lecture, and tomorrow I shall be dealing with, Herodotus and Thucydides in great detail. This lecture was actually conceived in order to make you familiar with under what circumstances these histories developed and why they developed in only Greece, not in other parts of the globe, except China. America, New World was not inhabited, so we don't know about them. But in the old world, what prevented rise of history as a serious discipline? Thank you very much.